Hi, I'm Fred McNeil, and thank you for watching QAC TV 7. It's November, and it's time of the year. We're all inside. It's a great time to read some books, and we're starting our show again. It used to be called Papa's World. Now it's local authors, and we've got a guy with you who is not only local, but he's got some great stories. Jack, thank you for being with us, okay?
Thank you, Fred.
Now, Jack, let's do this. How about, let's start from the very beginning. You've got this wonderful media background. Matter of fact, I was just with Jeff Strait, the PR guy from the Board of Ed. He says, Fred, whatever you do, ask him if Dave Duran was a good guy. So how about share with the people where you live in now here in the county, and tell us about all this great stuff you do.
Okay, we live in North County. We live up in the Chester Harbor community. We've been there 13 years. Moving to the shore was the best thing I ever did, besides getting married and having children.
There you go.
But my media career began way back in 1967. I was still in college, and my professor, who was a retired
where'd you get?
University of Baltimore, and my professor, who was a retired Baltimore Sun editor, came in one day. He says, "The News is looking for reporters. I think you ought to apply."
Shaum, you got a job.
The News American, a daily paper. So I started at a metropolitan daily newspaper while I was still in school. It usually works the other way around, you know. So I was with them for 5 years, covering some of the suburban beats in and around Baltimore.
While you're going to school, so you
exactly. Go to school at night, work during the day. And then in 1972, I left there to go work for Congressman Bill Mills, who represented the 1st District in Congress, and I was his press aide. And I was there for a little over a year, and unfortunately he died in office. And then there was a brief spell as a public relations representative for the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, and then in 1975, I went with WBAL Radio and was there for 27 and a half years.
Probably the biggest station, it used to be, it probably still is.
It's been the #1 news talk station for a long time in this region.
And I know what you did, but tell the people what you did every day for how many years?
Well, I always like to say that people will come up and say, "What do you do the other 55 minutes of the hour?" You sit on the air, you read the news, and that's the easy part. The tough part is the 55 minutes when you're interviewing people, breaking down tape. We used tape in those days. Writing your stories, designing your newscast, and so forth. And by the time
you're not drinking coffee and eating donuts, you're rewriting everything, right?
And by the time you go on the air, you're going, whew.
Now you did the morning news?
I did it all over the map. It's a 24/7 business. I did an awful lot of mornings, which meant getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
A whole different lifestyle.
And especially on a snow morning. You go out at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're convinced there's not a living soul anywhere else on the planet.
How far from home is WBL?
It's on the TV hill. So I only lived about 15 minutes away. But it was funny. We always joked about, well, we had to find a way to get to work so we could tell everybody else to stay home.
Well, I can remember I grew up in the Washington area, WTOP, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There was one terrible storm we had in the mid-'60s where the announcer was actually stuck in the studio. They couldn't get him in. I guess he and an engineer are holding down the whole, it was a CBS affiliate, holding down, running the whole Washington bureau, and he finally just said, "Look, folks, someone bring me some donuts and coffee." So it was that. Now,
it was a great career, though. I mean, it opened a lot of doors. I covered things I probably would have never covered anywhere else. I mean, I covered presidents when they came to Baltimore. I had press credentials when Pope John Paul came to Baltimore.
You were kind of the voice of news in Baltimore. I mean, that's what locals will tell me.
Right. Well, I was a reporter and an anchor for the 27 and a half years, and then we decided we wanted to make a move. I took early retirement from WBAL in 2002. We moved over here in 2002, and since then I've been working for the Bay Times and lately also for the Record Observer.
And covering everything.
Everything.
I mean,
and it's
elections.
fun. It's been a lot of fun. There have been a lot of neat stories to cover, interesting people, made a lot of friends. It's just, I'm convinced in a previous life I was a small-town boy.
Now, before we get to you, but who was the most interesting person? I'm sure you must have been a lot. There's one person that sticks out in all the years of, let's say with WBAO. Was it a president or an athlete or what? Someone who just, is that too tough?
It's really kind of hard to say. I mean, one of our own people was one of the most interesting.
Who was that?
A fellow named Alan Prell.
Oh yes,
had a talk show,
yes.
And he was the most amazing, amusing,
my
creative
wife
guy.
broke my heart. Did he not commute from me to Northern Virginia?
I think so. Yeah.
It broke her heart when they replaced. Remember when WBO changed its philosophy a little bit, and broke her heart because Perot. He was great.
But actually, if I look back over my whole journalistic career, I think the high point was when I got to go with the Queen Anne's County Education Delegation to China for 10 days.
Oh, okay. That was a great time.
I never, and the wildest dreams thought that I'd end up in China.
You must have gone. Did you go to the tour after I went or before?
We went in April of 2002. Okay. 2010. I'm sorry.
I went. I think I was with Paul. Who was Aarons on that? Steve Aarons with you on that?
No,
one?
Steve Aarons wasn't. Some of the number of teachers, our teacher of the year, and a couple of others, and we made the rounds of the schools.
China is amazing. 1 billion people. I mean,
it was a very, very interesting place, and I'd love to go back. And I never had any real interest in the Orient until this gave me that opportunity.
The last thing, we were spoiled. I don't know about you. The first-class hotels, the meals, and then we had to do some salute or a toast every time. And I'm sitting there going, "Oh Lord!" Everyone had around the table had to do the toast.
That's the one where you had to drink it all at one time, right?
And I'm sitting there, guys. I drink 2 iced teas. I'm in trouble. All right. Well, Jack, thank you for that. Now let's go. What prompted you? First book?
First book where I'm the sole author.
Okay.
I co-authored a book back in 1981 called Majesty at Sea with a friend of mine who's a professor at Delaware State University, and it was about the great four-funneled ocean liners of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, ships like the Titanic, the Lusitania, and the like.
Still in print?
Pardon?
Still in print? Is the book still in print?
No, it went through 2 printings, but that's pretty good for a book of that type.
Okay.
And but I've been a ship enthusiast since as long as I can remember.
In the Navy or family?
No, I wasn't in the Navy. I was in the Marine Corps. But when I was 8 years... By the way,
thank you for serving. Veterans Day coming up.
But when I was 8 years old, my folks took me on an overnight trip down to Chesapeake Bay on the old Bay Line, which was the last remaining overnight steamship company in the world. And my mom knew the captain.
Just one night?
Just one night, 12 hours from Baltimore to Norfolk. They did it back and forth every night. And my mom knew the captain. Well, needless to say, that opened all kinds of doors. Before that night was over, I was in the wheelhouse. I took the wheel, I read the radar, and the next morning, I blew the whistle.
Steering the boat.
I did indeed.
So it's just something, it was a kind of a hobby, kind of an interest?
It's just kind of been a passion all my life. I build ship models. I've collect stuff. I've been collecting things on Chesapeake Bay steamers for years, and that's kind of where it began, with riding that overnight steamer and then learning more about the different routes, because steamboats on the Chesapeake Bay in the 19th and early 20th century were such important parts of the economy.
Nick Hoxter, you know Nick, we do a series of shows with him, and he just tells us about the ferry boats and the whole, what was going on in the bay was amazing.
Well, you look at the bay and think about it before there was a bridge, but before there were even passable roads or railroads. The only way you had to get from here over to the western shore, obviously, was up and around on stagecoaches. It might have been dirty and dusty, or it might have been muddy, or it might have been frozen, and you never knew when you were going to get there. And over the years, first there were sailing vessels on the bay and the Chester River, and then about 1821, the first steamboat, regular steamboat to the Chester, came from Baltimore. And it served 2 purposes, actually more than 2 purposes, but the farmers on the eastern shore wanted to get their products to the market as quickly as possible. The steamer was reliable, whereas the sailing vessel had to rely on the wind.
The wind.
Conversely, the people that lived here took the boat to Baltimore to get things that they couldn't necessarily get over here, maybe clothing, medicines. And when the boats came back, they'd bring things back such as building materials, things that the farmers would need that you just simply couldn't get over here.
Right, for the Eastern Shore folks, right?
And there's a terrific photograph of the inner harbor of Baltimore in 1912, taken from up on Federal Hill, if anybody knows what that is. And a line of steamers down Light Street and a line of steamers down Pratt Street.
Either moving
there
people
were dozens of them, and there were as many more out on their runs as there were tied up at the dock.
A whole different era.
It was a very, very important part of the local economy, and it was that way until maybe 1920, when the railroads started to grab hold and the roads were getting better, and the last steamboat line, the old Bay Line, lasted until 1962.
Well, Nick Hoxter, he says to me every time, he says, Fred, the ruin, downfall of the Chesapeake Bay and our whole society was that Bay Bridge, all the water traffic, whatever, but that's Nick. Hey, let's talk specific. Lost, Chester River Steamboats from Chestertown to Baltimore. Now, tell me about this.
This is about, a lot of folks have said, is Smokey Joe in the book? Smokey Joe only gets one mention.
Okay.
Because that was a ferry that ran from Baltimore to Love Point. It didn't go up the Chester.
Okay.
This is about the combination passenger and cargo steamers that ran between Chestertown and Baltimore and made stops all the way along. Some of the boats would begin and end their trips in Crumpton, so they'd go Crumpton to Buckingham
all these
Wharf.
little towns.
Yeah, and they crisscrossed the river as they came down. Where Camp Pacomath is now was once Booker's Wharf, Rolfe's Wharf up south of Chestertown. Queenstown was a huge calling place because they shipped animals, and a lot of the animals got on board the boat in Queenstown. They stopped at Bogle's Wharf over on Eastern Neck Island, went up the Corsica to Centerville, and it was about a 7 or 8 hour trip. By the time things got
all the way to,
by the time the ships got really reliable, the engines were more powerful and so forth. So they would have left Baltimore and Chestertown about 7 o'clock in the morning. You had breakfast on board. Food was fabulous.
Oh, I imagine.
The food on Chesapeake Bay steamers was
what type
famous.
of food would they eat?
A lot of emphasis on local seafood, local produce and the like, and the tables had the white linen tablecloths, heavy china, heavy silverware. It was really something, and that sort of thing. The silverware, the china, have become real collector's items these days, and I've got more than I think my wife wishes I had.
Your garage has all this. Hey, as we go, how much did it cost?
Over the years, it really wasn't expensive. I would say that probably the average cost of a trip from Chestertown to Baltimore, not including the meal, was about $1.50.
$1.50.
And the meal might have been.
You mean the years again? I didn't mean to interrupt you. Early 1900s?
I'd say the latter part of the 19th century.
Late 1800s. Okay.
The boat stopped running in 1923.
Okay.
But then you got your meal. That was a little bit extra, and. When you're in the river or out on the bay, you had the opportunity to go out on the open decks and take in the sea air and so forth. And
the reason, the book fits in with if you take in I think it's called the Packet cruise they had, and I can imagine getting in Chestertown 7 o'clock in the morning. It's such a delight. You just go on a Packet tour. Whatever the ship is called, you just go out an hour and come back, but we go by Rolfe's Wharf. Apparently FDR at one time pulled in there, that type of thing. So you get on the ship, he's talking about a 7 or 8 hour trip to Baltimore. Now, could you come right back, or was it overnight?
You could, couldn't come back because the boat would overnight in whichever port it was, and then they'd come back the next morning. Now, sometimes they'd have some that would run, say, from Centerville to Baltimore, and they'd go down the river, hit Queenstown, Bogle's Wharf, and then they'd go up to Rock Hall, and then across the bay to Baltimore. In fact, the very first steamboat to visit the eastern shore went from Baltimore to Rock Hall in 1813.
1813.
Very first steamer on the Chesapeake. It was named the Chesapeake.
Okay, 1813.
And during the War of 1812, when the British were prowling all over the bay, they were looking for that steamboat. And Admiral Coburn just missed it a few times.
Well, take us through the book. Okay, where do we start at?
Well, we start back. I began with sort of a lay of the land. What is this region like? Why were there boats on this river? I mean, they were there for a reason. They weren't just pleasure cruises. And then we go chronologically through the first off where the independent operators, or say an individual or two individuals. So
you and I would buy a boat?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And your name would be in the ad in the paper as the proprietor. Yeah. And about 1860-something, a gentleman named Henry Slaughter, who lived up near Crumpton and had some patents on peach packing and that sort of thing, started a line called the Slaughter Line, and that was when the boat service became daily, one in each direction.
Regular service.
Right, and unfortunately he died at an early age, and in following him was a company called the Chester River Steamboat Company, which was perhaps the best known, and the gentleman who became president of the Chester River Steamboat Company was Bud Sterling Ford, state senator from Queen Anne's County.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
with these, let me just go back. As you talk about these independent operators and the slaughter line, were they making money?
Yeah, they made money.
They did well. Okay.
And there were some interesting little anecdotes at the bottom of the advertisements in the paper. They didn't publish brochures. They advertised simply through ads in the paper, and it would say after the boat arrived in town, so and so would deliver such and such to Mr. Jones's General Store,
right in the
say
ad.
in Centerville. Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I really enjoyed doing with this was doing a sample trip. say from Chestertown to Baltimore on the steamer B.S. Ford, which was named for Mr. Ford. And we kind of went down the river and we stopped at the different wharves, and the pictures go along with it. There's a great picture of the steamer tied up at the foot of High Street in Chestertown. Then we got them coming into Booker's Wharf, and people are standing down there on Booker's Wharf with their suitcases and whatnot. And then down in Queenstown, we got pictures of the deckhands shoving cows into the freight deck.
Are most of the landing spots, I mean, excuse me, but most of the places, well, obviously Chestertown, that's still there, right?
Actually, actually, the only landing that you could say is original is Indiantown Wharf, which is just above Centerville on the Queen Anne's County side. That wharf has been rebuilt and repaired over the years, but the owners tell me that the imprint is exactly as it was in the day of the steamboats. High Street Dock in Chestertown, where the river packet leaves from, that's the same place, but the buildings aren't there any longer. And if you get extreme low tides, you'll see some pilings poking up at some of the locations. Crumpton, for instance, and there's a picture in the book, they believe this is where the steamboat wharf was, and there's this long line of pilings that extends out into the river.
So it fits this, probably where they came into.
And they came in right there, and you know, they had packing houses and granaries and everything. It was quite.
It literally was the highway, like you talked about the highway.
It was, yeah. When the highways around here were made of water, it's exactly.
Jack, I kayak about 3 times a week. Now I'm on the Corsica River. I go from Centerville up the Corsica, a little beyond where Gunston School is, but the beauty of there, and then as you go in there, when we did the Packer cruise this summer, the beauties, I mean, the heron are everywhere, the fish are, I mean, the eagles, I mean, it must have been a marvelous.
What I like to tell folks is, and I've taken the packet down the river, is that the shoreline really hasn't changed very much since these boats operated.
It's magnificent. I'm sorry.
I mean, you go down and you're sailing on a beautiful countryside, then a nice estate might come into view that's been there since the 18th century, and it's just beautiful.
Now let me ask you, one of the chapters, Triumph and Tragedy. Can you tip us off to that?
That was when Mr. Ford became the president of the line, and business was so good that they built a new steamer and they named it for him.
This is a B.S. Ford.
B.S. Ford, and then a few years later they built one called the Emma Ford, which was named for his late wife. Unfortunately, he died in a beach accident in Ocean City at the age of 39 years old. And that's the tragedy. The Triumph was building the 2 new steamers, and the other part of the tragedy was the B.S. Ford burned in Chestertown one day, and they thought she was a total loss, but they rebuilt her on the original.
While it was docked, it burned.
And they rebuilt her. Yep, because they had wooden superstructures on an iron hull. So if a fire got started,
got out of control.
But it's interesting that they thought they lost that boat in 1884 with that fire, and it turned out to be the longest lived steamboat on the Chesapeake Bay. Because after they stopped running passengers in 23, they converted it into a freighter, and then they converted it into an unpowered barge, which went back and forth between Maryland and North Carolina, bringing pulpwood up to the paper plants, and it lasted until 1960, when it ran aground and sank in the Honga River down in Dorchester County.
Jack, let me talk. Do you know much about the cruise? I mean, who were the captains and who were the crews? I mean, Nick Hoxer talks about when the ferry boats, he worked as a young person on the ferry boats. They were fed there. He said you were spoiled, Fred. Well, any much about their lifestyle?
I think a lot of them were local folks, and because the company was started over here, a lot of them were from here. Ford began his career as a clerk. And then he became the purser on the boat, and then he became the captain, and then he became the owner. The owner, right? And I think that a lot of these deckhands and the like who worked on these steamers, it was a good, steady way of making a living, and they were from over here.
So they're local rock hall guys, maybe Chestertown guys, and they say, "Hey, are you willing to do this?" And you're a deckhand, that type of thing.
Exactly. And all walks of life, passengers from every social level took these boats back and forth.
Now, in the 7 or 8 hour trip, no staterooms, and that's it.
No
you sat in like a bed.
They had what they called day rooms. So if you wanted a little bit of privacy, you could pay a little bit more, and you had a little room that might have a window that opened onto the outside, but they didn't have bunks and things like that. The overnight boats, and this was one of the rare routes that was strictly daytime. Most of the ones that went to the eastern shore rivers, such as the Choptank, the Nanticoke, and so forth, they were overnight boats out of Baltimore.
So you probably ate well. You probably had fresh fish, the catch of the day, that type of thing. Local veggies, that type of problem. Okay. So they could take the 7 or 8 hour cruise. Could you go could you buy tickets? Say if I want to go from Chestertown to I don't know. Could
somewhere
you get
along the way?
Yeah.
You didn't have to necessarily go to Baltimore. You could take a boat
go anywhere
any place you wanted,
Okay, so
and you could get on any place you wanted.
Oh, okay.
And there was a big deal when these country wharves like Booker's Wharf and even Rolf's Wharf back in those days. They hear the steamer coming.
Everybody run
They'd
down
blow the whistle as they came around the bend in the river, and then everybody from the surrounding farms would come down and congregate on the dock. Steamboat time was a big deal.
Did they move the mail or anything?
Yeah, they carried mail.
Okay.
They carried mail because and the folks who lived in the area came down to see, hey, does the boat bring my package today? And the farmer talked to the shipping agent. Here's my crop. Take it to Baltimore for me and sell it.
Now, how did this the Twilight year, how did this all end? Probably not well.
Well, it wasn't too bad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was growing by leaps and bounds in the 19th century, and it had a presence on the Delmarva Peninsula, and it wanted to get the steamboat lines to have a comprehensive transportation system, so it slowly bought up a lot of the lines. And the Chester River Steamboat Company was one of them. It was acquired in 1904. It was then run by a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania called the Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia Railway, and then later on it simply became called the Chester River Line of the MD&V. And it lasted until 1923, and by that time more people were taking cars and trucks and trains. So it made it through
World War I.
That's right. And it shut down in 1923. And a few times in the 1930s and once or twice in the 50s, a single steamer would visit the Chester River. A steamer named the Emma Giles, which was very famous, came up the Chester. And the last steamboat to come up the Chester River was the Bay Bell, which used to run to Betterton, and it came up in the 1950s. But since then, there haven't been any steam-powered vessels on the river.
When we first moved to the shore, it would have been the late 70s. We used to go to Betterton, and I believe where they had dances and boats came in, it was still, the pilings were there and the pier was there, and it must have been, like you said, the ships come in, everyone running down there, and dances on Friday or Saturday night or whatever. Jack, here's what, having taken the trip up the Chester River with the packet cruise people, I cannot believe this could not be started by some interesting person and say, look at an overnight trip to Baltimore, stopping in these, I mean, what do you think?
In a perfect world,
I'm not proposing in a perfect
world, I wish it could happen because I've often said that if I could see that steamer coming around the bend,
you'd be on
blowing her whistle, I think I'd give an arm or a couple of years just to see it happen. Because I got aboard for the very tail end of steamboating on the Chesapeake, and I've got such vivid memories of it. And it was a totally different time, a totally different world, and unfortunately, folks who didn't have the opportunity to experience it really missed out on something.
I can remember just in the ferry boats in the 50s when I dropped my grandfather. The big trip for us was from Washington, D.C., take the ferry across the bay, go down the Tidewater and have a meal. But I remember the great pace. I'd sit there and you could look into the where the captain was, and I'd be eating they used to have this great little orange crackers with peanut butter, but it was slower and calmer. You could talk imagine a trip like this. You go to these little towns, people are waving and telling stories and sharing good stuff.
It really was a very important part of the local way of being, not just the need to get things back and forth, but this was almost a social experience. Boats come into town, let's go down to the dock.
Now, any real great characters? I mean, the one gentleman that we talked about, the B.S. Ford, Mr. Ford, any other great, are there any great people that stick out as this?
I can't think of any great people. There's one story in there that I kind of like. There's a chapter called Wars, Fogs, Storms, and Ice on the Bay. And there was one time when I believe it was B.S. Ford had left Baltimore to come back across toward the Chester, and they got out in the bay, and it was quite stormy. And the ship was pitching around, and the waves were coming over. This lady came up to the captain and said, "Captain, do you think this is really safe? I don't think we should be out here." And the captain looked at her and said, "Madam, I think as much of my life as you do."
I'm going to take care of you, right? It's a bit, but it just, like I said, it goes back to the sense of innocence of that time, but also just the pace. Now every time we get in a boat or a plane or a train, right, we're always facing the clock. You talked about going to China. Did you get on a high-speed train? We're zipping along at 200. It's like, this must have been leisurely, calm,
It was, and as I say, having not ridden these, but having ridden the bay boats down in Norfolk, I know that the experience had to be very similar, because you figure the way these ships were decorated inside, they had mahogany and all of that sort of thing, stained glass.
Real craftsmanship.
Yeah, right, it was real, and these companies were proud of these boats, and the people, when the B.S. Ford, for instance, came to Chestertown for the first time, the local media just couldn't play it up enough. This was the biggest thing that had hit town in a long time.
It's like any big ship coming anywhere. Hey, this is interesting. Now, Jack, let's do this. If people, hey, we've teased them a little bit. If they want to get the book, how do they get it?
Well, it's in a number of local stores. I can't say at this point exactly which ones, but it's also available online, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and the History Press, which is the publisher. If you go to their website, it's available there as well. And I can't say enough about the work that the History Press folks did with me, because the difference between publishing this book and my one in 1981 was
totally different.
That was all the sort of thing where you boxed up all your original photographs and you shipped them off. This was totally digital.
All electronic? Yeah, all electronic.
Totally digital. And it was a learning process for me, but boy, it sure makes, it's a good way to do it. That way, you know, you don't
run. It's a lot easier.
That's right.
Well, everyone I talked, Brent Lewis has been on the show a couple of times, and like he says, Fred, publishing has totally changed. I mean, it's easier for the author, easier for the publisher, and the good news, it's easier for the folks at home, because they can go to Amazon or whatever and get it. Right?
And I've got to say that I've had a lot of help from local folks.
Good.
The Kent Island Heritage Society has been good to me. The Queen Anne's County Historical Society, Kent County Historical Society, individuals.
You tap them all.
That's right. You mentioned Brent Lewis. He's offered a lot of advice, because he's published with History Press twice, and I will say that a lot of these illustrations came from local collections.
Good.
I think a lot of the illustrations in here haven't seen the light of day in published form before.
So by getting a book, you'll see them first. Now, Jack, I can see all your enthusiasm for what's next. You already got something writing already?
I've got a couple of projects in mind. Then they're all steamboat related. One is I see a book similar to this about the Baltimore and Philadelphia Steamboat Company, which ran between those two cities through the C&D Canal.
Baltimore and Philly.
And it lasted almost 100 years, and it stopped at places like Betterton and the Chesapeake City.
So all these little towns kept getting hit. Good.
Another one has to do with a set of East Coast steamboats, not just from the Chesapeake, but say Long Island Sound and some other places, never designed to go in the open ocean, mind you. They were commandeered for service at the beginning of World War II and sent across the Atlantic in a convoy of nothing but steamboats, escorted by 2 British destroyers.
Delivering
and they actually did battle with German U-boats in the middle of the Atlantic.
Steamboats?
Yes. yeah. I mean, they had...
that would be a great story.
They had ancient armament put on board, but apparently it was such a fierce fight that I believe the Germans, when they announced this battle, said that they thought they had sunk several transports of the Queen Mary class.
They're steamboats. Oh, some of them were sunk. We don't want to take away.
A couple of them were, but the rest of them made it to England, and they were used as cross-channel transports. A couple of them were hospital ships that went over to D-Day. One of them was a headquarters ship at Omaha Beach. Incredible story.
Good, write that book quick.
I really want to do that one.
Well, Jack, let us that time goes by too quick. Let's remind everybody, the name of the book is Lost Chester River Steamboats, all right? And you can get it Amazon. And where else? Remind me where else we can get it?
BarnesandNoble.com. And some of the local stores are getting it, so hopefully it'll be available locally.
As soon as I cut off here, I'm going to buy a copy, because you got me enthusiastic. Folks, if it sounds like a good read, all right, and the good story is there's probably going to be more stories out of this, all right? Jack, thank you. It sounds like a great book, all right? Okay, Fred McNeil, thank you for watching QAC TV 7. Good winter read, all right? We'll remind everybody, Lost Chester River Steamboats, all right? Thank you very much for watching TV 7. My time's up. Thank you for your time. We're going to see you next time.